Cindy's a professor within the College of Agriculture at California State University at Chico, and she is an Rollins Endowed Professor for Environmental Literacy and the Director for the Center for Regenerative Agriculture and Resilient Systems. Cindy, I look forward to your talk.
Wonderful. Well, greetings everyone from sunny California. Yeah, it's a beautiful day here. My thanks to Naomi and the rest of the planning committee for the opportunity to present today. I consider it a real honor. Particularly today. Today's the first day of my granddaughter's life. She joined us last night, so we're pretty excited about that. And I think on behalf of grandchildren everywhere, it's time that we double down and make sure we get this right. So I appreciate everything that everyone is doing around the globe. And let's talk a little bit about resiliency in the current food production system. But before I get there, I do want to make these disclosures. Currently, I'm with California State University at Chico. I've been here for the last 20 years. Previously employed by the University of California, Davis. These are some of the boards and consultancy work that I've done in the past and some of the funding that we have underway. And this is how I view resiliency. This is what resiliency looks like in our world. This is going to be a very farmer-centric presentation. We have farmers all over the globe that look a lot like this. This happens to be North Central Illinois. This is my family farm. This happens to be my father, fourth generation farmer. My family continues to farm in that region. And it's folks just like these that are on the front line of our national food security program. And it's their ability to survive and thrive under crisis that's really critical to our survival. And, clearly we're living in a time of crisis. We've got rising greenhouse gas levels. I think that the previous presentations were pretty clear. We've got some real issues that we're trying to move through. Climate change has had one of the biggest impacts on production agriculture. Try farming in the midst of all this chaos. It's more than complication. This creates some big challenges, specifically on our farming communities. And then you need to couple that together with some of the impacts of the trade wars from the last couple of years. That's a 70% drop in our market, which is pretty significant. And clearly, it appeared as though, there was, some light at the end of that tunnel with that $40 billion purchase promise from China, but then COVID hit, and that blew that up completely. And whether or not any of that will come to fruition is really still, to be seen. But over the course of the last few months, we've seen significant drops in dairy prices. Corn's down 14%, soybeans 8%, cotton 31%, hogs down 31%. This is impactful. This is having some big, serious impacts on production agriculture. And I find it fascinating that there's this dichotomy within the food industry. We're seeing the grocery outlets and the packaged food industry seem to be doing pretty well, through this particular crisis. Meat packers and institutional food suppliers, not so much. And we're kind of seeing that same thing in production agriculture. There's a dichotomy in the impact that it's had on our farming communities. This is a clear example of the impact that, COVID has had on a perishable commodity crop producer. They were hit the hardest. These are the kinds of producers that really lack diversity. They were unable to pivot to alternative markets. Their whole context is really about low cost, efficiency, maximization. They got big to stay in under this cheap food policy that we have. They have one market outlet, and that is because of a contract. They can't, sell to this person on Monday and the other. They're contracted, and to violate that has legal implications. And unfortunately, they're at the bottom of our food chain. They're a price taker. Whatever that market is at, that's the price that they receive, and there is no control on their input costs. So they're particularly vulnerable. They are not what I consider to be resilient. There are lots of regulatory issues. So the system is really stacked against these kinds of producers. And I think, this is the ugly part of farming, and that is, this issue of bankruptcy. Chapter 12 farm bankruptcies are up significantly. So as of March 2020, we're seeing an increase in 23% in farm bankruptcies. Farm debt's never been higher in this country. It's an issue. And what goes, and unfortunately it coincides with this, is suicide rates. I mean, the farming community is 1.5% higher than the national average. And the CDC suspects that that's probably not as high as it likely is, because sometimes, those aren't reported necessarily, accurately. And the dichotomy of what we're seeing is that some of the local food systems, are looking a lot more resilient in this particular crisis. For instance, this Local Harvest, it's a website that connects consumers to over 7,000 different CSAs across the United States. During COVID, they had 5 times the normal hits on their website. So trying to connect consumers with local farmers in their region, it basically blew up their server. They couldn't get to the amount of demand that they had in that particular system. And I want to showcase a few producers that I would categorize more in that resiliency type category. The Sloop Farm, for example. I mean, they were a commodity-based commercial farm. They were providing hogs to Tyson. So again, commodity type pricing, they're a price taker, they're everything that I was talking about earlier. But the exception with this particular operation is that they were able to pivot and adapt. They began processing locally with a Mennonite type business. They were outsourcing their cut and wrap, and they began selling online, and they did this within a week. It was survival to them, but it worked. And they're sold out. And many of our demonstration farmers that are part of what we consider to be a local regional food system are in that same position. They cannot provide enough product for the demand. Whether or not that will persist is another thing. But frankly, if they're able to provide service and a good product, we're hoping that they can hang on to a lot of those new customers that they're seeing, which is fabulous. White Oak Pastures is another icon. I would imagine many of you are familiar with Will Harris. Will is kind of the epitome of resiliency. That farm is a multi-generational farm. It dates back to 1866. He's vertically integrated. He does a lot of direct marketing. And he's got tons of diversity. So, he's got a variety of different practices, different products. He's stacking his production paradigm. He operates at scale. He manages holistically. So he really is a systems thinker. And we've mentioned that many times this morning. I can't overemphasize how important it is that you start thinking along those lines. Hey, and if you haven't seen his video, it's really wonderful. It's called 100,000 Beating Hearts. I highly recommend it. So the recipe for a resilient farmer, in my mind, is really a state of mind. It's a mindset. These are the kinds of farmers that really know how to adapt to change. They stay out of debt. They understand their market. They manage for diversity. They manage holistically. And of course, they know how to manage stress. And no matter how you shake it, farming is a very stressful business. There's no doubt about it. So in our view, from the qualities that we would see and want to see in a resilient food production system is a system where farmers are actually rewarded for good stewardship. Does it require massive debt? There's parity pricing. So in other words, there's continuity between income and costs rather than what we have today. It's a system where we build soil carbon and water efficiency. It's a system where we value soil health. We value the ecological systems that we operate within. It supports diverse markets and competitive pricing. And of course, we need to support local economies in rural communities. Now that's a resilient food system. And unfortunately, we have a lot of hidden costs currently with our current approach. We are losing soil. We continue to lose soil. We continue to emit. And I agree that, there's discrepancies in numbers. This is a global number, and I know our number is lower. But we are losing nutrients. We're seeing nutrient loss, and we really can't afford that. We're losing a lot of our institutional knowledge. It takes, what are we, 1% now of the population is actually involved in production agriculture, and we're losing them at a record rate. Nutrient density is declining, species diversity. So, we've got some really, really big challenges. And I know that this talk is supposed to be, about resiliency in our system, but we really need to get a handle on the fact that we're not resilient, not by a long shot. And we really do need some cost accounting on the true cost of what it's taking to put food on the table in this country. And I love this report, the true cost accounting and the future of food. I left the link here. Please take a look at it. I think it does a really good job at drilling down on just that, the true cost of our cheap food policy. So we have a bit of a disconnect between efficiency, which is what we have, and resilience, which is what we need. And this is where, the work that we do at the center is about building that resiliency into our food and fiber system. Regenerative farming practice build in that resiliency. This is a paper that was published in Scientific Advances that talks specifically about, the climate mitigating potential of these various production practices, which all fall under this window of regenerative type agriculture by our definition of regenerative agriculture. The relative benefits of regenerative farming practices, are huge. We're going to emit a lot less. There's going to be less pesticide use because there's less of a need. Less nutrient runoff. We don't want to lose those nutrients, and in many cases, they're very expensive to apply. And then soil conservation, and of course, we're building soil biology, which is kind of a critical piece that we basically ignore in production agriculture. And where are these resilient qualities? Aside from our farmers and ranchers, which continue to farm and ranch under these crises situation, I consider those resilient properties in our current system. We also have these programs that I think are really critical. Some of them are not where we need them to be yet. Some of them aren't funded at the level that we need them to be funded. But hey, it's a great place to start. The Natural Resource Conservation Program, many of you will know this, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program, both of these programs are really designed to do that, to help producers bridge that transition period and to get them started down that path of regenerative type climate smart ag. Are some issues with that? We can talk offline, but we need to embellish that program and make it more accessible and more usable. We need to increase the incentives. And I think that there's a whole host of ways that we could enhance that program to see it more widely utilized. In California, we have a new program, the Healthy Soils Program with the California Department of Food and Agriculture. Last year, it put $22 million into regenerative farming practices just last year, and that impacted over 30,000 acres. And, based on modeling work, it reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 73,000 tons. And so that, that's huge, but this might be on the chopping block next year because of COVID. With a $54 billion deficit now, we're in trouble. So whether or not that is going to be able to persist, I'm not certain. This is what these regenerative practices look like. This is what NRCS and CDFA and others are promoting. Cover crops, green manure crops, never bare soil, always a living root, trying to embellish soil organic matter on a regular basis. It promotes crop rotation so that we eliminate a lot of the need for pesticide because we're breaking those pest cycles with the natural rotation of crops. Compost and animal manures, this is a great way to add nutrients into that soil profile and also enhance the nutrient cycling component. No-till and low-till disturbance. There's a lot of interesting data out there on this, and it's another situation where we're trying to keep that soil covered, try to keep an insulating cover on top. And the highly debated adaptive multi-paddock grazing strategy. It's a system in which we're moving cattle in a managed rotational system, and I think it's, this is one of the first research studies that I think really help us understand how important it is that we not only change the way we farm, but we also change the way that we do research. Because what this particular study that was published in 2018 in Agricultural Systems by Paige Stanley and her colleagues, it really looks at how it's you must be looking at this as a system-based program. In this particular graph, it kind of drives home that point. You know, if we're not really looking at the system, and if we're just looking at emissions, a grazing system, which is in this heavy red bar, would be a bigger emitter than the more efficient feedlot scenario, where the cattle are finished faster and put back into the food system more quickly. That alone, you know, it would show that the grass-based system is not going to compare with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. But if you look at the carbon flux in that particular system, and you look at how much carbon is being put back into the system, it becomes a net carbon sink. So that, to me, is a fascinating study. I think it's pivotal, and I'd like to see more work along those lines. And I think it's clear as well that, you know, 1% increase in soil organic matter is going to increase our ability to withstand long-term droughts. It's going to help us hold soil. So any of these production practices that I've been talking about are designed to do just that, to build soil organic matter, which is our natural resource that we need to maintain. So as Ratan Lal has been quoted before, I've seen him talked about several times throughout this forum, and I really do appreciate that. You know, we need to be looking at the soil beneath our feet. That's going to be a solution to much of this. And it's also going to add to the resiliency in our food system, as well as to our farms and ranches. And it basically utilizes this basic biological function. I mean, right now the carbon cycle is way out of kilter. And so by altering this net carbon flux, you know, we can make big inroads. And the beauty of this system is that, you know, if you start stacking practices, it happens faster. You know, so oftentimes we can get producers started doing cover crops and maybe some crop rotation, and then pretty soon, you know, the light comes on and they're utilizing more and more practices all the time. This happens to be the learning curve for a very popular farmer, Gabe Brown. Many of you know Gabe. He has been implementing these production practices really over the last 3 decades. And you can see here is his carbon profile, his soil carbon profile as he's stacked practices in regenerative agriculture. And it's right here around this 3% soil organic matter where things really start to hum. And that's when we see a big shift in soil carbon in his system, when he starts layering in livestock integration on top of his cropping system. There's also a very important paper that I'd like to draw your attention to that just came out in June on climate mitigation potential regenerative ag. And it really addresses, I think, some of those folks that don't believe that there's enough science out there to back up this particular paradigm. And you know, according to this research team, they believe that the science is clear that regenerative agriculture can, in fact, have a significant impact on emission reduction and CO2 removal. That's the work that we do at the center. We're all about soil carbon, you know, sequestration, rebuilding biodiversity, creating more resilient farms and ranches. And I really like this diagram because I think it really shows where our resiliency is. It's in our farmers, our ranchers. They're a national treasure. We need to become more farmer centric, and we need to do everything we can to kind of help them, you know, move down this paradigm shift. So with that, I think I am actually ahead of time by 3 minutes. So I'll go ahead and take some questions.
Thank you, Cindy, very much. That was a very hopeful presentation about the potential for regenerative farming. We have a series of questions that have come in from the audience around the workforce, not just the farmers and the ranchers, but the workforce, and questions around how do we build a workforce that has the skills to be able to engage in this, particularly in the US, where so much of our workforce is actually migrant workers. So if you could address some of those questions, that would be interesting for the audience.
Well, I do think that that's a big one. For many of our large farms, you know, they really depend heavily on seasonal labor. That has been an issue. And there's been some big changes in California law and with respect to labor law and minimum wage and working conditions. So there's been that shift in that, and frankly, the food system is designed uh, to keep downward pressure on farm gate price, and because of that, there's downward pressure on pay. So if we really want to get busy with respect to try and provide a living wage to our farm labor force, I mean, we need to do a better job of bringing more cash into that system so that we're not always up against such narrow margins. I think that that's a huge piece. I know that there are labor force, the Will Harris farm, for example. I mean, he does a great job of infusing cash into that local economy. And where many farms were laying off their labor, he hired 16 new laborers to help him fill the need for his online ordering. I think, that the issues there are a real symptom of a broken food system that we need to address systemically in order that we can address some of the injustices that have happened with respect to farm labor. I don't deny that it's there. It absolutely is. And I think by altering the way in which, by enhancing our food production system in some of those resiliency parameters that I outlined would do a lot of good with respect to how we would be managing farm labor. And I think it would be a better living for farmers, and I think it would be a better living for farm laborers. And I'm pretty certain it'll be better for the ecological systems that we all live in.
Well, that's great. And I think we've got time for one more question. Can agriculture be regenerative and facilitate carbon sequestration equally or better without grazing?
Well, I think that's another highly contested question. So um, there's enough data to show that the livestock add another dimension into these systems. It's difficult to do because during this Earl Butz era, I mean, we really did specialize. We became corn farmers, or we became dairy producers, or we became, hey, and we lost that diversity, and that is where we lost the animals. I mean, when I was growing up in the Midwest, we were pulling out fence lines so that we could be growing more corn and soy. That was a mistake. Cattle are really an instrumental component, not just because of the protein that they provide, but also in terms of the land stewardship aspects of the animal on the land itself. I mean, they're great gleaners. They can definitely do a great job of converting a lot of that crop residue into really high quality protein for humans. They have, if managed appropriately, because I've seen it also where animals are managed inappropriately and there is ecological harm. But when managed appropriately, they're a real tool, ecologically speaking, where they could actually benefit landscapes dramatically. And I'm including riparians in that description, where I have seen where livestock can actually do quite a bit of benefit in those ecological systems. So I think they're great scavengers. I think they're wonderful for land restoration. I think they're great protein for society. I think that they bring a lot more to the picture than a lot of folks are willing to admit.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. And we'll move on.